Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 2 of Seed 540. So very glad to have you here with us in the course. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to point out a couple of course administration elements here. Please be sure to check out the revised course calendar under the syllabus tab in the course. I've changed a few dates and clarified a few things, so it's important that you have a look at that and save it somewhere so that you can refer to it in the future. As we mentioned last week, we have 3 themes for this course. And in this week's lesson, we're going to be focusing on human development and learning theories and applying those learning theories and development theories into our classroom practices. So before we begin discussing the content in this week's lesson, I'd like to have you think back to when you were in elementary and middle school. How did your thinking change when you went into high school? And how has your thinking changed since you've graduated from high school or undergraduate studies or even graduate studies? How has your thinking progressed throughout those various stages in your life? It's important to keep that concept of change and development throughout our life in mind when we think about these development theories. So for this week and the task that we have here ahead of us here, I'd like to have you read chapters 2 and 3 in the big book. There will be a chart in the weekly folder that you can use to guide your reading and guide your studying of these 2 chapters. I strongly recommend that you take a look at that. I'll be discussing that chart here later on in the video. The discussion board, as a reminder, you're going to be posting a question for each question thread and each question forum. If you've noticed in the folders, in the little folders in the discussion board, it'll have the week and then it'll have question 1, question 2, question 3. You'll need to make sure that you answer each of those questions. And then on Sunday, going back into each of those question threads and responding. So I'm not a person to attach a number to each of the responses, but make sure that, for example, if you have 3 questions, you're going to have 3 questions that you're responding to and 3 additional responses, a total of 6 that you're needing to do for that week. That makes sense. In this week's discussion board, I'll be attaching videos that you'll need to watch before you post within each individual thread. There is an assignment that we're going to need to start thinking about here. And I need to have you start thinking about your topic for the theory to practice presentation. There'll be a PowerPoint presentation in the weekly folder. I strongly recommend that you look at that because in that PowerPoint presentation, there are some examples and some ideas that you can refer to as you come up with your own topic. Oh, and it looks as if my video is blocking this here. But the topic is going to be due on September 13th. I'll be posting some more information about that later. But I wanted to get you on the track and have you start thinking about what your topic is going to be for that theory to practice presentation. So a few comments on the tasks here. First of all, thank you very much for keeping the tone professional and respectful in the discussion boards. As I mentioned before, particularly the case study conversations, there are going to be differing viewpoints and people are going to bring their own perspectives to that conversation. So in order to kind of keep that conversation rich and to really expand our understanding, we need to make sure that we keep the tone professional and respectful in the discussion boards. And as I mentioned before, be sure to respond to each question in that week's discussion board. You see here I took a screenshot of the week 2 discussion board forum. You guys have done, and it's been great. Thank you very much. You've been clicking into that and looking at the 3 questions. Just make sure that you're answering each of those questions that are under that week's particular forum, and then respond to each within that thread, making sure that you have first response to the question and then a response within each of those questions. And again, as a reminder, when you do post in the discussion board, make sure that your answer is substantive and referenced. A few of you have done a really good job of citing the books, citing page numbers, and we really need to get into the habit of doing that as we move forward. Okay, so let's get into the meat of this week's topic. Before we begin, each week I'm going to be looking at the top 20 principles that apply to this week's content. And for this week, we're going to be looking at Principle 2, what students already know affects their learning. Principle 3, students' cognitive development and learning are not limited by general stages. Principle 5, acquiring long-term knowledge and skill is largely dependent on practice. Principle 13, learning is situated within multiple social contexts. Principle 14, interpersonal relationships and communication are critical to both the teaching learning process and the social emotional development of students. And then finally, Principle 15, emotional well-being influences educational performance, learning, and development. In this week's reading material, you're going to be noticing that it's broken down into two separate groups. But I'd like to have you think of it more as a grouping in its entirety here. We're going to be looking at the 5 main areas or realms within developmental psychology. In Chapter 2, they talk about cognitive and language development. And it may seem like it's separate, but it's really part of that larger picture of developmental theories. Then in Chapter 3, you're going to be seeing personality development, identity development, social emotional development, and moral development. But again, I want to reinforce the point that all 5 of these are part of the concept of developmental psychology and the theories that are part of that. Okay, so we're going to take a look at each of these in order. I want to, again, really help to hone in on some of the key points I want you to take away. There's a lot of stuff here in these chapters, of course, but my job here is to really help you to focus on the key things that I want you to take away. In Chapter 2, again, we have here the cognitive and language development theories, and there are 3 that I want you to take away. The first one is Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems theory of development, Piaget's theory of cognitive development, and Vygotsky's social cultural theory of cognitive development. There is something in this chapter about neuropsychology. While it's very important, wow, you could have an entire course developed and discussing that topic. It's an important topic, and it's a hot topic within education right now, but I think for our purposes in this class, I want us to focus on these particular theories. So the first one, just briefly here, Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems theory of development. Okay, so this chart should look familiar from last week's conversation and last week's readings. If you remember from the little book there, they talk about the different levels of awareness. They talked about the micro, meso, exo, and macro. They really relied on Bronfenbrenner in that conversation. The thing that I want you to take away from this theory is I want you to take a look at that inner circle right there with the student. You see how the home and the school, the neighborhood, and the religious setting, those are the things that are closest to the student and the things that impact the student most. And the point here is that, yes, parents or guardians are the primary educators of students. They're their first educators. But the school is very important too. And it's important for educators to acknowledge the fact that their role in students' lives is incredibly important, as you guys explored in the discussion board last week. So again, really keeping in mind those 4 kind of elements that are closest to the student and the impact that they have on their development. Okay, Piaget. You'll see Piaget everywhere in developmental psychology. And he was a prolific writer, and he was all over the place. The thing that I want you to take away when it comes to Piaget and cognitive and language development are two big things. First of all, the concepts of schemes, assimilation, and accommodation. When we talk about cognitive development in students, we talk about the fact that students have schemes that they organize their thinking around. And I like to think of these schemes as buckets, or buckets that you can put information into that are common threads of information that are related to each other. I think in the book they talk about the scheme of driving. So whenever you're driving an automatic versus a manual car, you're relying on very similar concepts to be able to perform that particular task. You're driving, you have gas, you have a brake, you have gears, you have all those things. And they all go into that scheme of driving. And so whenever you have knowledge, whenever kids are developing their knowledge base, they're forming schemes to be able to put knowledge into, right? And that whenever you're learning new knowledge, your first step is usually to assimilate it and use the old buckets, the buckets that you already have. And then when you're exposed to new knowledge that you don't have a bucket for, you have to accommodate for that. You have to create new buckets. So the example that they use in the textbook, they talk about how whenever you're learning adverbs, and back in elementary school, you learned that in the English language, we typically add an ly, so quickly, softly, quietly, those kind of things. Those are all within the bucket of adverbs. But what happens when you have to learn something new? Like perhaps an adverb may be well or very. You have to accommodate for that new knowledge and either expand or grow that bucket that you had previously created, or you need to create a new bucket, a new understanding of what adverbs are, right? So you think about this all the time when you're teaching. It's like where you're activating prior knowledge. And that's a fancy way of saying that you're assimilating that knowledge into those old buckets. But you're also maybe encouraging students to accommodate new knowledge and create new buckets. The other thing that's important with Piaget is he has all these stages of cognitive development. And for our purposes here in secondary education, I'd like to have you focus on the formal operational stage. This is key, and in your practice, you'll see this formal operational stage play out over and over again. In this stage, this is where students start to develop formal logic, right? So A plus B can equal C, and you form like streams of logic whenever you're helping to teach students how to write. What is a logical progression in an essay, right? So you're teaching the students, you're showing students how to develop formal logic. Associated with this is the idea that students are developing abstract ideas. They're able to understand abstract concepts. This stage is when we usually talk about that perennial debate about when do we start teaching algebra to students. Do we start teaching algebra in 8th grade? Do we wait until 9th grade? When's the best time to start teaching this very abstract area of study? Some students are ready for it. They're ready because they've developed that abstract formal logic. Other students aren't quite ready for it. And that's an important kind of concept to keep in mind in secondary education, is how developed students are along these two points. The other thing that you'll see with students in this age is the whole idea of ideals versus reality. And you particularly see this in the YA or the young adult literature. You have characters like Katniss Everdeen or Harry Potter or Percy Jackson, these ideals that are portrayed in literature versus what may be reality. And students are naturally drawn to that. The other thing that you'll see in this stage is the idea that students are developing their metacognition. They're thinking how to think, and they're reflecting on their thinking. Where we see this most often is in science, in the science courses when we're teaching the scientific method. We're teaching them how to develop a hypothesis and then the progression on how to test that hypothesis. You're teaching students how to think. They're thinking on how to think. Now, one of the critiques of Piaget is that Piaget has a tendency of focusing on this natural development of cognitive skills or cognitive abilities. And that's not necessarily true, particularly in this stage. It's not automatic and it has to be nurtured. Some students naturally can understand that progression of abstract ideas. Sometimes they need to be taught. So it's important for us to keep in mind that during this formal operational stage, some of these skills really must be intentionally taught. Okay, so Vygotsky. Couple things I want you to take away when it comes to Vygotsky. First of all, he is the social interaction developmental psychologist, right? So we have Piaget that was more this internalized, very natural progression of development. Vygotsky, on the other hand, focused more on the social interaction. That cognitive development is facilitated by the outside, right? So the social interaction, the interactions that you have with other people within that Bronfenbrenner's kind of inner circle helps to promote cognitive development. And this is typically done with the assistance of a, quote, more knowledgeable other. That's one of his famous kind of concepts, that idea of a more knowledgeable other, aka educators. So how students interact with this more knowledgeable other promotes that cognitive development. The other thing that he was big on is the role of culture in cognitive development. So our understanding of how our very Western way of thinking may be very different from other ways of thinking in the world, right? In education, you're going to be hearing two concepts over and over again that are directly related to Vygotsky. The notion of the zone of proximal development, sometimes you see it written out as ZPD, and the notion of scaffolding. So I'm not going to go into these in huge detail right now. One of the videos that you're going to have in your discussion board goes into this in great depth. So I encourage you to look at that, take notes, and really deepen your understanding of that. But quickly here, the idea that students have to be, they're in their comfort zone and they need to move out of their comfort zone into that zone of proximal development. They need to be challenged. There needs to be this kind of push from that more knowledgeable other. And it needs to be progressive. It needs to provide those supports as the students move up in their thinking, right? Much like a building, and you have the scaffolds that are right next to a building to help support it. That's what educators do, is that they're providing that scaffolding, moving students up, moving them from their comfort zone into the next level where they're maybe a little bit more uncomfortable, but it challenges them. All right, so the next realm in developmental psychology is the whole idea of personality development. Now, the book doesn't really go into this in great detail or depth, but the thing that I want you to take away from this conversation is the whole idea of nurture. You have the whole nature-nurture conversation, which we all know about, but all the various environmental factors that go into that nurturing of a student's personality. The other thing that I want you to take away in this conversation about personality development, and this will be important later on in the course when we talk about classroom management, is that an authoritative classroom management style is preferred, providing the structure, the boundaries, where are the railings that students know that they just can't cross in your classroom. So again, reinforcing the notion that authoritative classroom management styles really help students in their personality development. Okay, the next big realm is identity development. And the theorists that we commonly associate with when we talk about identity development is Erik Erikson. And his theory of psychosocial view of identity development. Okay, the question that this answers is, who am I as a person in this environment in relation to these people? Just very specifically, who am I in this place with these people? And he, again, stages, 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 stages. But going back to one of our principles is that these stages are not set in stone. They're not concrete. And that you can move from one stage to the next. And maybe some things didn't transfer when you move from one stage to the next. And maybe there's some regression within the stages as well. That's important to keep in mind with Erikson, because even though he talks about that you must complete your stage before you move on to the next one, we now know that there's this kind of more fluid progression throughout these developmental stages. So, two important stages, particularly when we talk about secondary students, is identity and confusion. And you'll see this with, particularly with your upper, middle, and high school students. They're experimenting with roles. So one year they may be known as the jock, and next year they maybe be trying out the school play and participating in the school play. They're wanting to experiment with different roles to develop who they are, and they're trying out freedom with reasonable Goldilocks kind of freedom restrictions, right? So within an area that's not too restrictive and not too permissive. Students need that kind of Goldilocks environment to be able to try out their freedom. And that helps to create a sense of self, who I am, again, that person in this environment in relation to these people. The other step that's important for secondary students, we talk about intimacy versus isolation. You see this with the whole boyfriend-girlfriend dramas, those kind of things, and the whole notion of dealing with rejection. So not only within the relationship realm of boyfriend-girlfriend, but also how students are dealing with rejection. We're a culture that likes the gold stars. We're the culture that likes giving out the participation trophies. But does that really help students to understand and deal with rejection when it does occur? That's a perennial debate in education, is that do we give out the gold stars, or do we truly help students to deal with rejection, or sometimes maybe things didn't go your way? How are you going to overcome that notion of grit that sometimes you see mentioned in educational literature? Okay. So for the social emotional development, 2 points that I want to mention in this section. First of all, they talk about Goleman's Educational Intelligence. This is a very famous book. We're not going to go into it here. It's an excellent book. I encourage you to read it on your own. The thing that I want to focus on here is the theory of mind. For this is a relatively recent term or concept in educational psychology. And typically most people think about theory of mind as it relates to younger kids and how they develop that sense of self to others, right? And how they're able to think about how others are responding and then adjusting their behavior accordingly. But now we're starting to see that the theory of mind is developmental, that it's not just occurring in the younger years, but it's something that needs to be developed as students grow and as students progress through their education. So in general, theory of mind is the insight into other people's minds and reasoning about how mental states influence behavior. Okay, so it's that ability to put yourself into another person's shoes and to think about what that other person's mental state is and how that mental state influences the other person's behavior. But what's key here is that you're able to see that and then adjust your behavior accordingly. Okay, so a lot of the discipline issues that you see in middle school and high school kind of revolve around this concept. What was the other person thinking? Why do you think they were acting that way? And if you see them acting that way, how are you going to adjust your behavior? As a principal, when I had to do discipline for students, this was a conversation that I had over and over again. And for some students, it's difficult. It's a developmental thing. Some students get it quicker than others. Some students need that support. So again, as I said before, it begins at an early age, but the need for constant reinforcement, especially when social situations become more complex and systemic, right? So when you talk about like how you're able to put yourself into another person's shoes in elementary school, that may be very easy. It's like, well, Why did you kick Susie off the monkey bars there on the playground? That's an easier kind of one-to-one sort of thing that you can think about in trying to put yourself into another person's shoes. But what happens when you start talking about race or gender or some of these more complex social situations? It's a little bit more difficult, and students may need that support. And as part of this, and underpinning everything with this theory of mind, is the notion of empathy. How are you able to empathize with others, right? So social emotional development is kind of a buzz term. It's a really hot topic within education right now. I think there was a recent study that came out that a lot of parents don't like this term of social emotional development or social emotional learning, SEL. But it's important, as you guys have noted in your discussion board comments and responses. All right, so the final realm that we're going to talk about here is moral development. Typically, when we think of moral development theories, the big name that comes to mind is Kohlberg. But you also see Piaget. Like I said, he's everywhere. But the thing that I want for us to focus on here is the social domain theory of moral development. Kohlberg is very intricate and very advanced, and there's a lot of stuff that goes in there. But I think it's important for us to do the social development theory of moral development, because that is the foundation for our understanding of Kohlberg's theory, should later on you decide to look at that a little bit more fully. So the social domain theory of moral development, three things. Moral domain, the notion that there is right and wrong and justice. The conventional domain, where there are social norms and customs. The personal domain, where others may think something is wrong, but it doesn't necessarily violate others' rights. I think the example they give in the book is how parents may be upset that a student gets a tattoo. And as you'll see, as you read through this, and as I've said before, it's the foundation for Kohlberg's theory, it leads to that discussion about how one's understanding of these domains change over time. So our notion of right and wrong and justice as a 7-year-old is very different from our notion of right, wrong, and justice when we're 16. And how does that progress? And then how do we, as maybe 10-year-olds, think about some of the social norms and customs, particularly as it relates to, maybe, for example, calling your teachers by Mrs. Smith or Mr. Jones. And as later on, when you maybe get into high school and in college, maybe you're calling them by something else, by either their first name or preferred kind of address. And does that fit with your social, your notion of what's right or wrong and what's customary? And then, of course, the personal domain in high school is a big one. So students are starting to challenge what's right and what's wrong within their own personal world, and finding out what is something that is okay to challenge versus maybe not so okay to challenge, and understanding that when you do challenge something, it needs to not violate another person's rights. So that kind of gradual exploration of what is okay to challenge versus not okay to challenge within that personal domain. All right, so that's it for now. Please feel free to text me if you have any questions or concerns. I'm finding that is my preferred mode of communication. Unfortunately, I think the GMU account is still being a little wonky. But please feel free to text me at this number if you have any questions or concerns. I'll be happy to answer them for you. So for now, thank you very much and happy studying this week.